Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Peak Human podcast. And it is Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, March 29th. And we have an interesting show we want to do with you today. I have a close friend of mine, Neeraj Jain, who's going to we're going to have a little discussion about the study that came out on the impact of caloric restriction and aging. I thought there's a lot of interesting things here unpack, but this study kind of lets us talk about some of those things. So, Neeraj, what do you think about the article I sent you?
Yeah, no, great article. It's a new study on an old topic, right? We've been talking about calorie restriction for a very long time in terms of longevity, but I
Yeah,
think this is probably one of the better done studies. Uh, if I'm
yeah, and I think it's good because this is maybe just the this study. I'll just go through the the structure of it. It's called the CALERIE study, and it has some long mnemonic, but basically it's a caloric restriction um, and aging study, and they basically took 220 people and randomized them to um, a group. I think they randomized 2 to 1, so approximately double the people. So like 150 people were randomized to caloric restriction of about 25%, and the other control group was just they could eat what they wanted, and they followed them for 2 years. And these were men and women who were middle age. Women were premenopausal, so before they hit menopause, and the average BMI was 22 to 27. um, 77% white and 70 sorry, there's somebody at the door, but don't worry. 70% women. So I think this is a well-designed trial. It's never really been done before. Like,
right, a lot of anecdotal stuff or smaller studies, but they actually put a control group and a fairly wide selection of healthy middle-aged people, right?
yeah, exactly.
So,
And yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
tell us what was the punchline here? What did
Well,
they
the
find?
punchline was basically, and again, so what they did was that they already came out with results some, a year or two ago, where they looked at that this caloric restriction basically improved cardiometabolic markers. Like these people lost weight. I have it here that the control group maintained about 10% weight loss. Um, Let me not know the active group. Yeah, is this correct? Yeah, I just want to make sure here. Do we have this here? Maintained. I believe that, yeah, the yeah, that's right. The caloric restriction group had a 10% weight loss, and there was no change in weight in the ad lib group. So they also had improvements in their blood markers, and and one concern was that the resting metabolic rate would slow down, and really there was no slowdown noted in the caloric restriction group after 2 years. So that's kind of a interesting thing, but
Actually, even
yeah.
the 10% weight loss, I mean, that is pretty dramatic on people that are, their BMIs were not very high to begin with. But I guess with a 25% calorie reduction, you're definitely going to drop some weight.
Yeah, I think that's just how it tells us that, yeah, that the weight loss is definitely an important aspect of this, that people are having it. But what's really interesting is that not even everyone had achieved 25%. I think it's like the average was much lower than that. And they did an analysis of of the groups. They looked at people who lost only did about less than 10% of caloric restriction versus those that did greater than 10% of caloric restriction. And there was definitely a change in the benefit. Like the more caloric restriction was done, more benefit it was achieved. So
Okay, actually, that was one of the questions I had was, did they see any kind of sort of minimum effective dose, right? Was there a point at which it's almost useless to do it and a point at which sort of things kick in?
yeah, I think that even at the less than 10% caloric restriction, there were still benefits. At least when we're looking at the biologic age part. So maybe we can jump into that. But I didn't look at the cardiometabolic benefits, but definitely for the aging benefits on the this paper that we're talking about, they still notice some improvement on even with less than 10%.
Okay, let's talk about the aging, the biological aging markers.
Right,
So
right.
something I found very interesting was the change was very little, right? They only found what, like a 2%
Two, three
improvement.
percent, yeah, 2 to 3
But
percent change.
but I think, I read somewhere in there, but that actually translates to a fairly large impact in terms of mortality.
Yeah, just this exact quote was that a calorie, which is the name of the study, treatment effect of 2 to 3% slower pace of aging corresponds to reduction in mortality risk as much as 10 to 15%, which is similar as smoking cessation intervention. So it's as strong as quitting smoking. So it might feel like it's not that effective, but it's compounding, right? Like when you're every year, if you're like slowing down by 3%, that's pretty.
So actually, sorry, I don't want to make sure I understand that correctly too. It's the pace of change slowed by 2 to 3%.
Yeah.
So every year I'm essentially aging 2% less,
Right.
which is really seems quite small. Like what's 2% a year? It's like a week.
Yeah, yeah, but that's why I think. But isn't it that you are? It's compounded,
Yeah.
like compounded interest. So like, like over 2 years, like it's you'll
Yeah.
gain that week, and then you gain another week, and I think it over time will build up. So that's my sense of it. So I can talk a little bit about these aging clocks, and Dunedin pace is quite an interesting. It's an interesting clock as compared to the other ones.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like So basically, in this study, they said, we know there's benefits in this cardiometabolic risk thing. Now let's look at, are we actually seeing reversal of aging or slowing down of aging? And so there's been a whole bunch of these clocks, and they're based on the methylation of the DNA spots, so the epigenetic changes that are happening on the DNA. And they can basically, as we're aging, there's certain patterns of methylation that's happening on the DNA.
So
And go ahead.
methylation is basically where some molecules are attaching themselves to the DNA. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. So it's just there are basically these methyl groups that are coming on and they're attaching to the DNA, and then that's causing the DNA to be expressed differently. It's like if you can imagine a book that someone's markered up the book on certain words or like written over certain words, then the meaning of the DNA, the meaning of that book will change.
Right.
The meaning of those words will change, or the paragraph. So same thing is happening here is that as we're aging, little methyl groups are being attached to the DNA, which then changes what genes are being being read by by the cell, and what proteins are being made, and so on and so forth. So it's like the book, in effect, the language is being changed, the words are being changed of the DNA and
Right.
how it's being read. So
now, why are there so many? There are several different, clocks, and they make reference to a few. So maybe describe the difference for us.
Yeah, it started off with what we call first generation clocks, and now they were more basically trained to the chronological age, right? So they looked and say, okay, they would get these samples of samples from human samples of blood, and it basically say, okay, if this person's age 50 chronologically, what is the pattern of their
Right.
DNA? And they would train it to see how accurate can we basically create a clock that's really well trained to the chronological age. But that doesn't have a lot of benefit. Like if you can imagine that, what's the benefit of having a clock trained to the chronological age when we already know the chronological age? Like there's no real benefit to that. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So the initial clocks are very good at telling you what your age was,
Okay.
but you already kind of knew. So
you kind of, yeah.
So I think what they started to do is they started to train these clocks to other things that are more interesting to us, like mortality. So grim age is trained. They actually start training it. Okay, to other, what's the death? Oh, so it's what we call second generation clock. So it's supposed to be more accurate to actually give you biologic age.
Okay, but they're still looking at methylation, but they're looking
They're
at
looking
different.
at methylation. They just have trained now those methylation patterns to different outcomes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they're more they're more active. They're more accurate. I'm sorry, I don't know why all this beeping is happening.
No
but
worries.
but the Dunedin AM OAM clock is different than others. And what they did here was that back in 1970, they took a group of people born, little kids, like a year or something like that, and they have been following that group of people since 1970.
Wow.
And they have been doing all these like physiological tests on them, like they've been doing like their pictures of their face and their grip strength and a whole bunch of biometrical blood pressure and blood tests and so on. So they have a whole bunch of these metrics, and they're monitoring the people's age as well as seeing how the changes are in all these various aspects. And then they've trained, and then so they've figured out, okay, this is the changes that happen over time on all these different metrics. And then they've gone ahead and just trained that to the methylation. So they found what's the correlation to kind of compare
Oh,
the
wow.
methylation to these various other.
So, so is it considered to be a better measure?
Yeah, it seems to be much more accurate. And what this study is showing is that this there was no change. There was no significant change in. There was no significant change in these second generation clocks, but there was change um, in the Dunedin POAM clock, and that's really a pace of aging clock, because it's not. The other clocks are just a particular time and place. Like, what is your age based on the DNA methylation at a particular time, whereas Dunedin POAM is more like a it's more like a dynamic clock. Means it's looking at how fast you're aging at that particular moment.
Sorry, so it by taking one test, it can tell you the
Yeah, I don't
pace.
know. Yes, I think maybe we need a scientist here to explain how that exactly happens. But yes, that's exactly what it is. So the result comes back at anywhere from, let's say, a zero point 0.7 to, let's say, 1.4. And what that means is that, let's say if you get a zero point 0.7, which is an amazing result, you're aging at 0.7 years compared to somebody else who's aging at 1 year. So when the average person's aging 1 year, you've only aged 0.7.
Okay.
So that's what happened in this study. So if you look at the numbers, I had this here. I'm just going to pull that up really quickly. That study showed that the 1 second here. I'm just going to pull that up. Here it is. They have a little thing. Maybe we'll put that up there. Yeah, here it is. So basically, the people in the caloric restriction group had a number that started at zero, obviously a baseline, and then they went down to like a 0.1. They went down to like a 0.85, and then a 0.9. Whereas the people in the other in the control group increased their aging to like like well, this is by percentage, but okay, this is a percentage, but uh, but it actually had some actual numbers there, but it's something like they went up like 20 points, 10, 15 points or something like that on every year.
Right, which would be considered average,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah, the one is considered average, and someone could be aging at 1.1, which means they're aging an extra 10% faster than.
So, I mean, so obviously this sounds quite interesting. It's easy enough to do. Just
Mhm.
eat less. Well, sorry, it's simple. I don't know how easy it is. It's a simple intervention.
Yeah.
But were there any, did the study talk at all about any negative consequences? I know there was, people lost weight to a certain amount. Any changes in body composition, energy? Like, did they study that at all?
Yeah, the body composition, like, I couldn't find it. I'm sure that, I mean, we need to go look for that. That's a really good point. Like I said, there was a weight loss change, and the resting metabolic rate, it looks like it didn't change, which is great news. People didn't slow down their metabolic rate. Um, if you look at the actual numbers of people, they actually had it here. That So they started with 145 people in the control group. I mean, the caloric restriction group, and um, only 117 completed the intervention. So 26 people stopped the intervention. Um, you know,
Yeah, I saw that. Like there was some women that got pregnant, some moved away. There were a variety of reasons.
yeah. But if you look compare it to so that's like 80% completion.
Yeah,
And if you compare that to the ad lib group, which was more like 90% completion.
right,
So there's, some of the people, you don't know why they actually, maybe they just found it was too much. They just
right.
found it was too difficult to do. And like I said, like, 25%, the average was much lower than 25%. So most people can't do 25% caloric restriction without feeling uncomfortable.
Right.
So, that's the problem. Like what type of real life lessons do you get from this? Like that, what do you think?
I was thinking about it. I'm like, I don't think I could do 25% caloric restriction. And tell me if you think this would be useful. I thought at the very least, I should cut out junk calories, right? If I prioritize calories that come with nutrition and
Mhm.
deprioritize, and I mean, we kind of know this, but desserts and junk food that really come with little nutrition, I'm probably tipping in the right direction.
Yeah, but would you be hungry? Like how hungry would you be? How uncomfortable would that be? Like it's still caloric restriction. Like you probably would replace it with more healthy calories,
Right.
and would you still have benefit?
Yeah, you're right. I guess you're right. At the end of the
Mhm.
day, it is caloric restriction that they've measured. So,
Yeah, they didn't look at what type of calories or anything. Just that strict reduce your calories, and that's generally quite hard for people. At least at the beginning, until their body gets used to it. We don't know how long that would be, but most people, I think, would be fine.
okay, that was another question I had. I mean, 25% off what baseline?
I thought that I thought that they did measure like people's baseline, but you're right. I don't for how long that baseline was calculated. I don't know. Was there a change in activity? Like, I mean, if you start eating 25% less calories, you're probably going to be less active. You might be less energetic. You might just want like that's another concern I would have with this study.
Right. So it's not easy to have a lot of good takeaways, like actionable takeaways right now, unless you're
I,
willing to
yeah,
to, to
I
actually do
think
it.
what this is proving is that caloric restriction works, but whether so I think what we could do is if we could find ways to mimic caloric restriction, that's probably a good idea. Like for example, it'd be interesting. Hey, what would be the impact of like intermittent uh, fasting or just like a couple of days fasting and just regular food? Which there maybe we should do that on a different show, but I think that there is some science of these other fasting programs that basically their benefits may not be just the fasting and maybe the actual caloric restriction that happens when you do intermittent fasting.
Right. So yeah, I think maybe it just raises a lot more questions because if can you do caloric restriction for a period of time? Say it's a day or a week,
Hmm.
and then go back to baseline and still see
Hmm.
some kind of benefit from that.
Exactly.
Or like you're saying, if we figure out what the mechanism is, can we mimic it? Can we
We
have maybe
mimic it, and like you know, basically that we think that this stimulation, this mTOR pathway, is what causing aging, was speeding up aging, and and fasting stimulates a separate pathway called the MPK pathway. And so if we can find other ways to stimulate that pathway, maybe it's with particular types of medications or supplements or other lifestyle methods, then I think there's something here because it looks like caloric restrictions is by far the most powerful aging, anti-aging, remedy out there at this moment.
at this moment? Yeah. Actually, I thought of a takeaway.
Yeah.
What instead of maybe caloric restriction, we just need to make sure we're not in caloric excess, right? It's another reason to monitor, like to not eat, really to not overindulge.
Yeah, I think that's because most people probably are in caloric stress. people are getting about 10 pounds a decade. Maybe 25% is not what we need to aim for. Maybe we need to aim for 5%.
Yeah.
Which is totally doable. Like I think it's doable, and maybe body could get used to that, and so there's definitely that type of takeaway that we shouldn't be eating excess. We could just reduce somewhat, like you were saying, like some of the unnecessary calories. And then I'd be interested to figure out, okay, maybe if you did fasting 1 day a week, you could eat out the next 6 days like regular, and you would end up with your 10% reduction in calories. So
yeah, I think maybe we should talk about that. Be interested to revisit that Prolon study.
Yes, because the Prolon study, people are not aware. Prolon's a fasting mimicking diet, where you basically eat only what's in this box for 5 days, and is supposed to stimulate the same pathways as fasting. It's approximately 800, 900 calories a day, something like that.
Something like that. And then I think it starts and it even goes a bit lower on some of the days.
Right. Yeah, we could look at that. I know they had some improvements, cardiometabolic improvements, with their intervention of three different fasting periods, separated by 1 month. But I think there's some other studies as well we should look at. I think intermittent fasting, there's a couple of studies as well looking at the impact of intermittent fasting. But I don't think they've looked at aging as an outcome. That's why this study is really interesting, is that it's the first study to look at aging as an outcome.
Right.
With caloric restriction or fasting.
Well, that's great. I mean, you're right. Like this certainly takes us a step forward, but still leaves a lot of, like all good science does, leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions.
Exactly. All right. Well, I hope that was helpful for our viewers, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
I'll put these notes in the show notes for everyone. Okay. Take care. Bye.